So let's launch into it, because your time is precious as educators and within the department as well, and great to have you here. All right, so tonight we'll be chatting about evidence into action, really focused in on literacy. So looking at specific ways that we can improve literacy within our students, and then looking at ways that we can use different approaches within the toolkit to teach literacy. So I myself am in Melbourne, broadcasting from Melbourne, and so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. For me, this is very meaningful. I've been fortunate to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in many different touch points throughout my career. In fact, it was working with 2 Aboriginal students that made me decide to become a teacher. So great to be standing and being on this land. Now, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, we have the wonderful Associate Director, Danielle Toon, who's in our Q&A box, and we'll be answering any questions as we go. So here's an outline of what we'll be covering today. First, we'll be starting off at looking at what does the evidence actually tell us about the effectiveness of different ways to teach literacy. And then we'll be looking at more broadly, what are effective ways that we can teach in general, and specifically, what do we know is more or less effective within literacy as well. And then how do we actually measure literacy outcomes, and then looking at the evidence ecosystem, which is where our conceptual model of the way we think about evidence use in Australia, and we'll walk you through that. So I thought it would be fun to start with a quiz, because who doesn't love a quiz on a Tuesday night, right? Everyone loves a quiz. So what I'll do, I'll activate the polls, and this will be there in front of you. Phonics and oral interventions are all effective ways of improving literacy. This is indeed completely true. These are effective ways, and there's 3 effective ways that you can find within the toolkit and within that evidence base quite clearly. All right, now I threw in a tricky one. Oh, and you've all, the majority of you have seen this too. So what are the effective ways to teach literacy? So there's various different approaches within the teaching and learning toolkit, and I've listed those out, and you've got 3 options to choose from. So, and it's the last one, so the one that does include peer tutoring and collaboration and digital technologies, because there are some effective programs that can actually help us with teaching our students literacy. So that was fantastic. Thank you. And you should be seeing those results coming up on your screen. So we've done the quiz fantastically. And now let's have a look at that evidence base that we can see. So this is the original paper that has been incredibly well cited by Hart and Risley in 1995. And what they found, and what they used in order to measure this, was that they had students actually inside the houses of the people, and they measured how many words per hour, and they just took that measurement for 1 hour. And so this is the differences that they identified, was that there were 30 million more words that were used from those in the higher socioeconomic group in comparison to those in the lower socioeconomic group. So that was quite a substantial difference. They also found that there was more encouraging linguistic input, as well as expansions and recasts. So them actually talking back to them and responding to them, which we know is some of the key early foundations for early literacy. Now, the more recent literature shows us that there have been similar findings, and then there's others that are a little bit in contradiction to these findings, and I'll take you through those. So the first ones were from a study where they found similar findings. So they produced from homes surrounded by lower SES, so produced fewer vocalizations, fewer adult-child interactions, and exposed to fewer adult daily words. Now, there was a study that came out this year, and it was quite controversially and I think inaccurately stated as a repetition. So they were saying that it was a repetition of the previous study that we were just talking about, but they didn't find the same gap. But what the sample is different within that group, so they've got none from a high SES, and what they found was there's similar amounts of words heard between families. I think with this study, it really needs to be truly replicated within similar populations, and also increase the number of people per study. I know in the Sperry, some of those groups in there only contained 3 people. So there's a bit of a background into the evidence base around, do we think that there's actually a difference when our students enter the school? I think any teacher would say to us, I think that there definitely is. And our job as teachers and as educators is really to and that's really what we're all about, is bridging that gap in education. So now what we'll do, we'll go through the 5 elements of evidence-based instruction. So starting off with looking at phonemic awareness. Okay, so phonemic awareness is really the ability to break sounds into their composite parts and to understand and to put those back together again. We've got the other definitions there around phoneme blending, phoneme segmentation, and manipulation there as well. All right, and then we have phonics. So phonics is really the teaching and helping learners develop phonemic awareness. So this is the decoding of sounds by sounding them out or combining them in blending and sound patterns. Examples of this are systematic phonics approaches that explicitly teach students the comprehensive set of letter and sound relationships. I guess as an aside to this, as a personal aside to this, I'll tell you a little story about how I wasn't, at that time of schooling, in my particular state, phonics was out of fashion within my classroom, and I know within my sister's classroom it was in, so she was taught phonemically and I wasn't, and I know that I still can struggle sometimes with making those sound letter relationships because I wasn't taught in that way. And happy to say that the system has repaired itself, and that my son, who's travelling through the education system currently and is 10 years old, sometimes helps me with sounding out of words because he has been taught systematic phonics. So I think that that is one of the crucial underpinnings of efficient and effective literacy teaching. But we have many other elements, okay? And what are some of the other elements? And that's fluency. This is the reader's ability to recognise words accurately and quickly, and to read aloud with appropriate expression. We all know how that can feel if people don't have the right level of fluency. And it's something that I know that teachers are very focused in on, and rightly so. So this can be encouraged through repeated reading. So learners read passages out loud several times and receive guidance and feedback from their teacher. We also know that home reading, where the child is reading to their parents, is one of the most effective things that parents can do with their children. Looking at vocabulary, there are, of course, this is the knowledge and understanding of what words mean, and also in communicating that meaning to others. So knowing what words to choose. And we've got 3 tiers of words here. So we've got the first tier, which is everyday words such as cat. The second tier, which is complex but occur regularly, such as coincidence. And then we have the third tier, which are specific context and I had to throw in a science one because being a science teacher, there's pheromone, but there's other ones like photosynthesis or deoxyribose, nucleic acid, all kinds of wonderful third tier words that I delight in. And then we have comprehension, which requires sufficient vocabulary, so the student needs to understand the meaning, and it's them also inferring and understanding meaning within the text. So teaching specific strategies that can apply both to monitor and overcome barriers to comprehension. These include prediction, questioning, clarifying, summarising, inference, which can be particularly hard to teach, and activating prior knowledge. And we've got all the references down there that we've come from for those. So if we look at the toolkit, we can see that we've got those 3 strategies right there, and there are our headline figures around that within the toolkit. If we look at what's quite nice is that we've just had an increase in the month's worth of learning impact for reading comprehension strategies. It's just gone up from a +5 months to +6 months, which is really quite exciting for all you literacy people out there, and is exciting in general. I've just written a blog about this, and we'll be pushing it out tomorrow in our e-news in talking about the latest changes within the toolkit, and this is one of them. And then we've also got phonics there. And have a look at the and oral language interventions. So we can see they've all got low average cost, the same low average cost, relatively compared to the rest of the toolkit. In fact, there's only 1 5 padlock rating for evidence security, and I'll walk you through what that exactly means in a second, and that is for phonics. So we know that that has the best evidence base, the best depth and breadth of evidence that the toolkit can bring backs phonics, and the rest have 4 padlocks, which is very high as well. All right, so we're reporting on average month's worth of learning progress, which is a translation from a mean weighted effect size to the month's worth of progress. We've got the cost to implement, and we've got the security of the evidence. So if we look at costs, this outlines the costs. So going from low, which we consider to be less than 160 per student per year. Low is about 320, moderate is 1,200, high is up to 2,000, and very high is over 2,000. Okay, so that's the breakdown of costs, and that can be accessed through the toolkit. Here's our evidence security. So going from very limited to very extensive. And we can see there that what we're basically talking about in those gradings is the depth and breadth of evidence. I heard Sir Kevin talk about this, and I like the way he described it. He was saying it was like having a stack of research, and the higher the stack, the more we can call it very extensive, and then the more recent the evidence, the more we can increase the padlocks, because we know that as the progress of any type of field, as we in education, we get more and more robust studies as we progress through. Great. So then the next one, which is my personal favourite, is, which you shouldn't have favourites, but I think you're allowed to have favourites, with this is the average month's worth of learning progress and how that translates to months of impact. So we've been getting this pretty much every, for the last 4 sessions that we've been running on the webinars, and so we thought we'd include this in response to that. Okay, great. Let's have a dive into the evidence base around the toolkit. So looking at, first of all, we'll be looking at reading comprehension studies. So here are the headline figures around reading comprehension studies. We can see that we've got low average cost, high evidence security, and high months worth of learning impact that have just increased with the inclusion of new studies into the teaching and learning toolkit. We've linked these specifically to the Australian Professional Standard for teachers, and there are the two there that they link most closely to. Great. So if we have a look, so what are reading comprehension strategies? So what they really do is help focus the learner's understanding of written text. So students are taught a range of techniques which enable them to comprehend the meaning of what they learn. So inferring meaning from the context, summarising or identifying key points, using graphic or semantic organisers. We can see one there on the right. I personally love a hierarchical concept map, but that's another conversation. And developing questioning strategies, crucial to really developing comprehension, and monitoring their own comprehension and identifying difficulties for themselves. So these are the key strategies embedded within reading comprehension strategies. And then we have oral language interventions. So we can see here that we're looking at 5 months worth of learning progress, high evidence security again, and low average cost, and linking again to this appropriate standards. So they're really, as the name suggests, emphasising the importance of spoken language and verbal interaction within the classroom. So they're based on the idea that comprehension and reading skills benefit from explicit discussion of either the content or the processes of learning, or both. Okay, so targeted reading out loud and discussing books with young children is one example. Explicitly extending the student's spoken vocabulary, and the use of structured questioning to develop reading comprehension. All right, so phonics, the last one in terms of looking specifically at literacy. We can see plus 4 months worth of learning impact, highest evidence security rating out of all the approaches, the 34 different approaches within the toolkit, and a very low average costs. So really focused in on teaching reading and some aspects of writing, focusing in on phonemic awareness. So it's breaking down and identifying and using phonemes or sound patterns in English. So decode words and sound them out by combining them or blending them in sound spelling patterns. So it improves the accuracy of the child's reading, but not the comprehension. Then we have to move to reading comprehension strategies. I don't know, I'm keeping a little eye on the chat box because I just can't help myself, and I can see there's been some fantastic questions, so please keep up those questions in there. Fantastic. All right, so moving more to focus on secondary schools. I'm a secondary teacher, so we're allowed to cover that as well as primary. So what's really important here is having an accurate understanding of where every student is at, and knowing that students will come with very varying skills and abilities in literacy to the secondary setting. So really within that, we need assessment that helps identify and then targets the next step of teaching. So whether those problems are predominantly related to word recognition, vocabulary knowledge, comprehension, or a combination of the above. So what are effective strategies at that year level? Both one-to-one and small group tuition can be excellent in helping students catch up. One One-to-one tuition has a higher average impact and more secure evidence-based, but of course it has an increased cost in comparison to small group tuition. So small group tuition can be a first go-to, and then before moving to one-to-one tuition, if small group tuition can be found as ineffective. And you can read more of that from that piece there. So that's just an overview at looking at what are effective options for us in the secondary setting. And if we just have a look now at, this is a summary of the research produced by, in part by Bob Slavin, was one of the key authors. I know that I'm a keen subscriber to his blog, so this is one of the best evidence syntheses. So I went through that and identified what are the individual programs that we know to be effective in secondary reading, and what are the name of the programs and what do they actually involve. So you can see we've got, on this page, we've got some that involve one-to-one tuition and some that involve small group tuition. We've also got the effect sizes there. So we can see, for example, that it's important to the dosage of that. So the amount that you do with the student is 1 hour of tutoring every 2 weeks with Year 7 students focused in on reading or writing. And the coach has worked individually with students. One-to-one tuition, that was 35-minute sessions once a week for 20 weeks with a substantial effect size of 0.42, which is well above and is a large impact. And within this, tutors are specially trained and they are actually teacher aides. And then there's small group tuition, which is butterfly phonics, and they have small groups. So this is a more cost-effective mechanism of 6 to 8 students with formal phonics instruction, understand the global aspects of the text, and class discussion of text meaning to improve reading comprehension. And this is taught by a trained practitioner and assessment. Other approaches were a collaborative approach, which involved working with partners in reading, story retelling, story writing, and word mastery. This had effect sizes 0.29, so quite effective. And this was effective in middle school students. So they work in groups of 4 to 5. And what's important is the detail around that, because what we find with this type of trying to translate evidence into practice is that if something specifically has worked in a specific setting, well, then we need to try and be as faithful as possible to the way that it has worked to try and make it work in our setting, bearing in mind also individual adaptations for our students. And then we have a metacognitive strategy that was slightly less effective, but it was effective, more effective for at-risk students. So this was, students were given the opportunity to read independently and work in small groups and receive whole group lessons. So that's a very different approach, as you can see, rather than collaborative learning or one-to-one tuition or small group tuition. So many different ways that we can try and approach and bridge the gaps that we know that exist for our learners. So that's all the different ways, and then there are different ways we can use these strategies to teach literacy. So we know there's one-to-one tuition, small group tuition, peer tutoring, digital technology, and collaborative learning. And we know that these can all be effective for teaching literacy in different settings. So what does the evidence base tell us about the best way to develop learners' literacy skills? We can have a look at the toolkit. If we just have a look at the headline figures there, so we've got one-to-one tuition, and we can see that the cost, as we know as educators, is quite high, and the evidence security is also high, and the month's worth of impact is high. This can be very useful in extreme examples where a student has fallen quite behind their peers and needs a lot of catch-up time and intensive work. I seen this used effectively throughout the world, but one particular example was in the UK when I was visiting a research school that partners with the Education Endowment Foundation. What they did there was that every 6 weeks they would monitor the growth of their students in various different ways. And if a student was found that they were falling behind the benchmarks, well then on that 6th week, they'd actually call home and say, look, is it all right if we have your son or daughter back tonight and we're going to give them free one-on-one tuition in the particular subject area to build the specific skills that we know that they don't have currently. And I wrote a blog about that. It was a very inspiring visit to that school. But I know that there's great practice across Australia with this generally. And then we have small group tuition. So this has a strong impact, not as strong as one-to-one tuition, which we wouldn't expect, and has a lower average cost and a relatively high evidence security, although not as high as one-to-one tuition or phonics. And then peer tutoring, we know that it has a very low cost because you're actually using your students, and we know that it's not just those that are being tutored that actually gain skills. We know that it's both the tutee and the tutor that are gaining skills throughout that. We know that ourselves as teachers, because every time we have to teach something new, we gain that knowledge probably to a greater degree than we ever have before because we're teaching it. It's the same for our students. I know for me, when I was a teacher, there was a particular class and they were struggling with a key concept that I was trying to teach them in. It was quantum mechanics. And I didn't know about peer tutoring, to say the truth, when I was a teacher. It was quite a long time ago. And one of my students, I remember, said, oh, Miss, I think I can explain that to, there was one student that just wasn't getting it, said, I think I can explain that, I won't use names, explain that to student B because I think I understand it. I think I'll be able to explain it better. And I said, great, I would love you to do that. Jump up on the whiteboard and, you know, tell us all. And what happened was quite fantastic. And I learned in that class that that was a key skill for me to tap into, was peer tutoring, was that my students were sometimes more capable than I was in reaching each other with the understanding and that next step. What's Vygotsky, isn't it? What's that zone of proximal development? And sometimes our students can be excellent at that. We can also do it with peers of different ages as well to work effectively. So that's a low cost, high impact for tutor and tutor. So it's a really win-win situation. Then we've got digital technology, which can be more expensive, has a high evidence security and a relatively high months of learning impact. There are different approaches within the toolkit, and you can go and have a look at the references to see specifically what programs have been shown to be effective in the literacy setting. We then have collaborative learning. We know that this can be very effective, strategies such as the jigsaw strategy. So making sure within this that it is truly collaborative and that students are playing distinct and definite roles, then we know that that can increase their learning to the greatest potential. So this is a summary of the effective teaching approaches that we've just been through, showing you the month's worth of learning progress, the cost, and the evidence security. Fantastic. All right. So how do we actually know that we're making a difference? Well, I know that you would be using many measurements within your classroom. Here are some measurements that you can use. So we've got pre and post measurements of auditory analysis of skills, how the students are progressing in their ability to read out loud, how the students are progressing in their ability to sound out new words. In the primary and secondary settings, we know that what's important is how the students building in their ability to build their vocabulary around subject-specific words, and providing a glossary at the beginning in subjects such as biology and in other subjects is incredibly helpful in building this. We have our NAPLAN results from reading, writing and grammar, which we are reported on, of course, for students in grade 3, 5, 7 and 9. We have our class grades in reports, which we can analyse. We can always analyse those too by converting the letters into numbers, which is something I love to do when I'm analysing data. And then we have our progressive achievement tests, which I've had many conversations with educators across Australia, and they've said that they are useful for them in reading and writing and plotting out the next steps of where to go for their students. So then, in thinking about that gathering of data and looking at the data, it really leads me to our evidence ecosystem. And within this evidence ecosystem is that exact process that I was just talking about, which is educators, one of the key roles is really to be continuously gathering practice-based evidence. And that's what I was just talking about, which is the impact of your teaching on your students and seeing what is that impact, measuring that impact every time you make a change. So if you're making a change to the way that you're doing reading comprehension strategies or the way that you've decided to implement phonics instructions, then monitor that change and see what the outcome produces. The second part of this is really how to get that evidence base and turn it into action in your classrooms. And that's really what this webinar series is all about. And the third part about this evidence ecosystem is we really see this as being a process that educators are at the heart of. As you can see them, they're in the smack bang middle of our diagram, because we believe that teachers and leaders are the key throughout Australia to implementing evidence in the classrooms, and nothing's going to happen without them. And we see and we hope that we want them to be driving the research questions that are based on their challenges, based on their data, and that should be being evidenced in the wider evidence chain through policymakers and researchers, and that being fed back with evidence in meaningful and practical ways. So I'll take you through our impact evaluation cycle in a second. So we know that there's lots of barriers to accessing and using research. Well, you know that because you're here with me now at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday night. You've carved out some time to talk about using and accessing research. There's a real shortage of time. When I was a senior secondary leader coordinating biology, sometimes I didn't have time to eat my lunch, and I'm not encouraging that as a practice, but it's a real shortage of time, and there's so many competing demands on your time constantly when you're an educator, constantly. And I have family that teach every day, so I'm constantly reminded of the reality. And then there's an overload of information to process. So information is not always presented in the easiest forms and digestible forms that are meaningful to yourselves as practitioners. That's really what we're here to try help. And then there's insufficient contextual information. So what does that actually mean? Okay, we know that that's effective, but what does it actually look like in process? What am I actually meant to do for my students? And so that's why we're really saying evidence in order to be useful to the profession. First step is production, which is fine. That's a book being produced, a paper being produced. But then we're saying it needs to be synthesised. It needs to be pulled together. I remember the delight when Professor Brian Caldwell handed me Professor Hattie's book, and I just saw it and I thought, this is beautiful because of the synthesis. Mazzano does it too. We do it in the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, is that synthesis. Pull it all together and tell me the narrative of that approach. And then we're talking about transformation. So we're talking about we need to add further information to make that valuable to you, such as what's the month's worth of learning progress, what's the cost to implement. And then we need engagement. That's what we're doing here tonight, and that's why I go out and spend most of my time pleasantly chatting with educators from all across Australia. I've had the good fortune to talk to face-to-face more than 4,000 of you across Australia. And that's an absolute delight just to see you engage with research and then to implement it. And then we're seeing people implement these and seeing real changes and meaningful improvements for their students. And that's what we're all here for on a Tuesday night. So let's have a look at that impact evaluation cycle. And here it is there. We'll break it down a little bit. Now, does anyone want to put into the chat box something that at the moment they are trying, an area of need that they have, an impetus that they have, something that they're trying to improve within their school setting? I'll give you a couple minutes. This is sometimes more interesting based in a real problem of practice rather than me making one up, but I'm more than happy to make one up as well. So if anyone has got any problems of practice? Yep, great. Oh, I love that. Beautiful, okay. Great, so reading, thank you for that excellent suggestion. So comprehension, so reading comprehension strategies delivered with cooperative learning structures, fantastic. And the impetus for this, I'm assuming, is you want to see improvements in reading comprehension studies. Feel free to chat back to me as we go. So the first part is you'll be identifying, okay, for my students right now, we're not seeing perhaps the growth in reading that we would like to from years 3 to 5 or from in secondary. So then we're going to say, okay, what is the evidence base around this? Thank you, secondary, great. On my team, no, sorry, I'm everyone's team because my son's in primary, but I'm a secondary, so I'm really the same. Beautiful. Okay, so we're in secondary and we're asking the question of awareness. So what does the research tell us about effective teaching strategies for reading comprehension in a secondary setting, specifically around cooperation and melding that with reading comprehension studies? We might go and have a look at the teaching and learning toolkit that we've just been through before and have a look. And then we'll be saying, based on the information that we've seen in the teaching and learning toolkit, what are some of the strategies that we know that could be effective in helping our students with reading comprehension? We know that inference is a big part of this. We know that using graphical organisers can be a big part of this. And we also know that using the jigsaw strategy, for example, is a highly effective way of structuring collaborative learning. So we could get our students actually to examine the different pieces of literacy interventions and how to best apply them. We could enlist their help in breaking down the evidence base around the most impactful strategies around research. I'm doing it currently with students from all over the NT in the primary and secondary settings around reading comprehension. So true story, I'll be listening to them pitch to the Minister next week. I'm off point, but sort of on point as well. All right, now we're at the adoption and adaptation. So we're going to say, what is it specifically about our cohort that we know that we need to adapt the information that we know from the toolkit, and then how are we going to adapt it faithfully as well, sorry, adopt with high fidelity. So what are the things we need to keep tight and what are the things we need to keep loose? We know that structures in something like collaborative learning are essential, and if we don't have them right, we're not going to have effective collaborative learning. So that's something we definitely know that we need to heavily scaffold our students, especially when they're starting out with collaborative learning. And then we're going to act, we're going to evaluate, and we're going to adjust our collaborative learning strategies with our reading comprehension. And then we're going to have a look at our results and say, have we seen increases in our students' reading from year 7 to 9, for example, and then we're going to make the decision to embed or admit. Great, so everyone's with me? You are all with me, fantastic. So that is what it looks like to implement a change within your school. And we're having schools use this cycle throughout Australia. So the top half is determining what you'll do. The bottom half is the evaluation process. So a little bit about evidence-informed decision-making. When we're talking about this, I really want you to bear in mind that we're really saying bring your whole self to the table. And I'll ask you now, how many years have you all been in education? If you can type that into the chat box. Because what you bring with you is so many years in education. And so we're asking you, awesome, wow, 7, 28, 11, amazing. We've got so much experience on this chat, 20, amazing. 27, sorry, I'm attracted to the numbers, 40, 14, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. You have all this amazing expertise that you have gathered. So we're not saying throw that out, but we are saying have a look at the evidence base and see how you can add that to your expertise. Use both at the same time, because, you know, teaching is both a science and an art, and it's unbelievably, I think it's unbelievably difficult, but unbelievably the best profession you could possibly be in the world, because you have that moral purpose of actually making a difference to the lives of students. So when we're thinking about what evidence is useful, different evidence is useful for different things, okay? So we have our randomized controlled trials. They're useful for informing what is best practice in the area. Emerging practices are incredibly important as well, because what the Education Endowment Foundation has found out, that out of all the things they've implemented in their schools and measured through RCTs, is that ones that have started out as teachers learning innovation in their schools based on evidence, they're the ones that have been the most successful. So we need to be fostering new practice and defining that new practice in order to share it across Australia. That's important as well. And I have the privilege of going to schools sometimes and doing case studies and looking at those emerging practices, and that's a very exciting part of my role. And then we have realistic reviews where they bring all the evidence all in together. And as I said, randomized controlled trials, some of which we're running. And this is a bit of the work of evidence for learning currently. And what we have is 3 randomized controlled trials. So we have a learning impact fund, which pairs a promising practice with and a promising program with an independent evaluator. And that's in our building evidence. In our sharing of evidence, that's our toolkits. We've mapped this to the evidence base and the policy base across Australia. So some of you are coming in from Queensland. We've mapped it to the National School Improvement Tool, same with those from you from the NT. If we have anyone from Victoria or New South Wales, pop it in the chat box for me, or other states and territories, let me know where you're coming in from. And then we also go and support schools in networks. So Victoria, within the department, we've mapped it to FISO, and we've worked, and Tasmania, we've mapped it to the National School Improvement Tool. WA, we want to, you're also working from the National School Improvement Tool as well, depending on what system you're coming from. Oh, great to have someone. Sorry, I'm a bit biased towards Tasmania, so thank you for joining us from Tasmania tonight. It's just a great spot. All right, so these are our learning impact funds that we have currently learning. Progressing. The most relevant to this discussion here today is MiniLit, who will be reporting on these results soon. We have just reported on Thinking Maths, and we'll be covering that in our last webinar in a couple of weeks. And we're also running ones on Quick Smart Numeracy and Resilient Families, which is a development trial. It's not a randomised controlled trial, because we know that randomised controlled trials aren't appropriate for every level of implementation. So if you bring something to scale, that's a good time to do a randomized control trial. And if you want to read anything more about those, also blogged on that as well. So MiniLit, we're running this in conjunction with the department in New South Wales. We've got this in with 273 students, and we'll be reporting on this soon. So that's Dr. Pauline Ho is leading these, and she'll be reporting on these with external evaluator. And now we have a spectacularly good amount of time for questions. And so I'm happy for you just to type any questions that you have throughout the whole webinar into the box. Great. Yeah, lovely. So we've had a great question and a great answer from Danielle Toon as well. So about researching on the effectiveness of benchmarking. So we don't think that in Australia there's been any comprehensive evaluations of different benchmarks in Australia, but we know there's some common criticisms on some methods, for example, running records, about whether they independently assess all the components of literacy. Dylan Willem has some great resources on formative assessment, and we know that that has just, his formative assessment has just shown to have +2 months worth of learning progress in the UK in a very large randomised controlled trial. So that's an area to look at. Also, I know that I was looking in the evidence base within the toolkit, and there was a specific literacy program, and then it measured specific gains in literacy around the effective use of teaching assistants, and I can dig out that paper too. So whoever wrote this question, send me an email and I'll send you another piece of specific research that might help you in thinking about that. Yeah, and the effectiveness of benchmarking is particularly, I think, is the author of the, pleasure, is the author of the question, what state or territory are you coming in from us today? Just so I'll think from your particular lens. And also if we have any other questions, feel free to pop them in. I can see that we've had quite a few questions around the conversion in the toolkit from effect size into months worth of learning progress. And I know that this is a common question. So what we do there is that we assume that a student has gained in 1 year 1 standard deviation worth of learning. So that's the assumption that underpins those conversions within the table for those of you that are interested. If we don't have any questions, I'm more than happy to give you an early mark, because I know that you've worked incredibly hard today and it's been a wonderful session. So I think we might, if everyone's happy, I'll just give you, our, oh, here we go. Lovely. Okay, how many strategies are optimal when introducing whole school literacy approaches? Well, generally in the evidence around change, we don't want to make more than 3 major changes, but those could include small parts. So I would suggest that making sure that you have touch points against the 3 key strategies, that being oral interventions, especially if it at the primary or the secondary, at the primary setting, and then reading comprehension strategies, and also phonemic awareness. If you have touch points across all of those, and also look at the 5 evidence-based areas of, and are measuring those consistently, I would think that that would be a good approach to whole school literacy. But what could be smart, and what is always smart, is that if you make a change just perhaps within 1 or 2 classrooms, measure and see if that's been effective, and then scale it up across the whole school, bearing into account what are the what I like is the terminology of active ingredients. So what is it specifically about different teachers teaching that makes it so, their teaching so effective? Great question there, thank you. Excellent question. Pleasure, absolute pleasure. All right, great. So I'll keep an eye on the chat box. But I think if anyone else hasn't got any questions, so please feel free to join our evidence-informed educator network. We let them know things a bit before other people, like this webinar series, and they're sort of our close group of educators that we trial and test new ideas with. Subscribe to the newsletter for updates at evidenceforlearning.org.au. And follow us on Twitter and Facebook if you're of that ilk. I'm on Twitter as well, so feel free to follow me and I'll follow back and we can chat there. And any comments and feedback back to me directly would be fantastic, because I also need my 8 months worth of learning progress, because it has 8 months worth of learning progress. All right, fantastic. Yeah, probably the last question in regards to writing strategies, the breadth that I'll go into is a bit beyond this format, but I know some good, and it's just been released in the latest metacognition and self-regulation guidance report from the EEF around effective writing strategies. So please pop that in an email to you and I'll give you a detailed response, because I know specifically what I can highlight back to you. So great question, and I'm happy to answer it individually, just because it will take a bit too long right here, right now. All right, fantastic. So we've got 2 more webinars to look forward to. We've got one left on parental engagement, social emotional well-being. Yes, so everyone that would like that information on writing, there was my email just before. So Tanya Vaughan at Evidence for Learning, just write to me and say, please send me the evidence based on evidence-based writing practices. And I'll send you a link to the guidance report and specifically the paragraph related to it. And I'd love to. It's one of my key pleasures. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you here all tonight. So we've got 2 more webinars. We've got the parental engagement, something that I'm very interested in, being a parent, and plus I've actually researched in the area, so that will be in a couple of weeks, and also social emotional learning within that as well, so which are really important and I think difficult topics. And then we'll be breaking down the exciting results from the Thinking Maths randomised control trial, and that will be Pauline and myself leading that. So I'd just left to say thank you very much to my supporting team. That's Shona and that's Danielle, and have a great night, and let's have an early mark. Take care. Bye.